The drive to Mirrow Estate took longer than expected, though the map had promised a straight route through the valley. By the time I reached the iron gates, the fog was so dense it seemed to press against the windshield like wet fabric. My phone lost service miles ago, and the GPS stuttered before dying completely, leaving me with only the echo of the engine and the rhythmic tap of rain against the glass. The sign above the gate was half buried in ivy, the letters barely visible through corrosion: Mirrow Estate, established 1784. The drive to Mirrow Estate had not only been long, but strangely disorienting, as if the landscape itself resisted my arrival. The directions I'd printed from the office were clear: follow the main road through the valley, turn left after the stone bridge, and continue until the iron gates came into view. But somewhere along that route, logic began to fray. The road narrowed until it felt more like a forgotten trail than something meant for cars, and the trees seemed to grow denser with every mile, their branches arching over the path like fingers trying to close the sky. There were no houses, no road signs, no passing headlights, only my reflection in the glass and the murmur of the wipers struggling to keep pace with the rain. I tried to shake off the unease by focusing on the task ahead. I had handled worse: companies in ruin, estates in dispute, families clawing at inheritance. The Mirrow audit was supposed to be routine. The last will was dated 2 centuries prior, but all I needed to do was verify the asset records, catalogue the contents, and submit my report. At least, that's what I thought when I first accepted the assignment. The case had arrived on my desk with little context: no client meeting, no briefing, just a sealed manila envelope with a single line typed across the front: Mirrow Estate, Private Commission. Inside was a brittle sheaf of papers that smelled faintly of smoke and mildew, listing a handful of accounts tied to the property. The ledgers themselves, the note claimed, were still on site and would need to be examined in person. My firm had received dozens of such cases before, old properties caught in probate, usually tangled in outdated trusts or forgotten debts, but this one was different in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The handwriting on the oldest document had a strange, uneven quality to it, as if the pen had trembled during its creation. At the bottom of one page was a faint watermark barely visible in the paper's fibers: Office of County Records, 1891. I tried to look up the Mirrow family, thinking it might help to have some background before I arrived. To my surprise, there were almost no records available. An old newspaper snippet from 1902 mentioned the Mirrow auction, but the article itself had been clipped short, the remaining pages lost to time. A local archive database listed a lawsuit involving the estate, yet when I clicked the link, the file had been redacted. It was as if the Mirrow name had been deliberately erased from every accessible system. The only modern reference was a scanned property tax form from 15 years ago, filed by an agency that no longer existed. My supervisor shrugged it off when I asked, saying, "Old estates have messy paper trails. Just verify what's still standing." The closer I got to the estate, the more I began to question that advice. It wasn't just the weather or the isolation, it was the sensation of being followed by the past. The road itself bore no signs of maintenance, and every turn seemed to take me deeper into silence. Even the radio faltered, hissing and snapping until I turned it off. The smell of wet soil and pine seeped through the car vents, and when I finally caught sight of the gates through the mist, I felt an involuntary chill crawl up my spine. The wrought iron was rusted and bent, the crest at its center barely legible under a coat of moss. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement behind the bars, just a flicker, perhaps a trick of the fog, but when I blinked, there was nothing. I parked the car at the edge of the drive and stepped out into the damp air. The temperature dropped sharply the moment I crossed the threshold of the gate, as though the estate had its own climate sealed within its boundaries. My shoes crunched over gravel that hadn't been disturbed in decades, and the fog clung low, curling around my legs like smoke. Through it, the outline of the manor emerged, tall, angular and silent, its windows like black eyes watching from a distance. The building loomed larger than I had expected, 3 stories high with gables that jutted out like shoulders hunched in disapproval. The stone facade was streaked with rain and age, the shutters crooked, and ivy climbed across the walls as though trying to strangle the place back into the ground. There was a rusted intercom box by the main gatepost, its button long fused from corrosion. I pressed it anyway, more out of habit than hope, but there was no sound, not even static. According to the assignment brief, a caretaker named Mr. Lyle was supposed to meet me upon arrival. I waited, scanning the grounds for any sign of movement, but the house remained motionless. Somewhere in the trees, a crow let out a sharp, echoing cry before the sound vanished into the fog. After several minutes, I decided to proceed on my own. The main gate, though heavy, gave way with a groan that carried too far, like something waking from sleep. The path leading up to the house was flanked by decaying statues, figures of angels and scholars whose faces had eroded into blank expressions. One statue, a woman holding a book, had her head entirely missing. The closer I came to the steps, the stronger the scent of old wood and wet stone became. There was something profoundly unsettling about the silence. It wasn't empty but thick, as if muffled by unseen weight. Even my footsteps seemed hesitant, their echoes swallowed before they could return. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The brass handle was cold enough to sting my palm, and as I turned it, the hinges released a moan that lingered long after the door opened. Inside, the air was colder still, and I could see faint trails of my breath in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. The hall stretched endlessly, the floorboards warped and uneven, lined with portraits whose subjects were too shadowed to make out. At the far end of the corridor stood a clock, its pendulum unmoving though its face showed the correct time. I checked my watch, it matched perfectly. Somewhere, faintly, I heard the soft, repetitive drip of water, though I couldn't see its source. I had only been inside for minutes, but it felt longer, as if time itself thickened in that place. When I finally located the study where the ledgers were supposedly stored, I found them stacked neatly on a desk, covered in a fine layer of dust but otherwise undisturbed. It was strange, someone had clearly organized them not long ago, and yet every inch of the room suggested abandonment. I flipped open the first volume, half expecting the pages to crumble, but instead, the ink gleamed faintly under the light, far too fresh for a record written in the 19th century. I leaned closer, tracing the top entry, and paused. The handwriting was the same as the note I had found in the audit file, the same looping script, precise yet trembling. At the bottom of the page was the same date, *1891. And beside it, a final notation scrawled in darker ink that made the hairs on my neck stand on end, *account active, auditor pending arrival. The storm outside had deepened into a steady, whispering deluge, the kind that seemed to settle over the land like a curse rather than mere weather. By the time I lit the second lantern in the study, the last traces of daylight had bled away, leaving only the muted glow of the oil flame and the steady pulse of rain against the window panes. The ledgers were older than I had first thought, some bound in cracked leather, others wrapped in decaying parchment that left residue on my fingertips. The pages spoke in numbers and signatures, but something about the way they were organized felt wrong. The handwriting shifted abruptly from one entry to another, as though written by multiple people, yet all of them shared a certain rhythm, a familiar tremor that repeated across the years. Most of the records stopped abruptly in 1891, the same year marked in the watermark I'd noticed earlier, but the ink in several entries appeared unnaturally dark, too new to belong to that century. I found myself tracing patterns that didn't belong in accounting, entries with no clear purpose, columns of identical figures written in looping ink, and annotations that made no sense to modern eyes, settled by decree, witness withdrawn, room accounted for. There were also occasional stains, brownish and irregular, as if water, or something thicker, had once spilled across the pages. One particular volume, larger than the others, contained nothing but names, no numbers, no currency, just names written one after another, each followed by a single check mark. I ran my finger down the list and paused when I reached the final entry, *Clara Hensley. The name appeared in at least 4 other ledgers, always tied to the same year. She had been paid for services, then marked as dismissed, then reinstated. No records after that. I searched for her file in the adjacent drawers but found nothing. What I did find, however, was a small gap behind the lowest drawer, just wide enough to fit a hand through. I knelt and shone my light into the space. The beam caught on something, an edge of paper wedged beneath a loose floorboard. At first, I thought it was just another ledger page, but as I pried it free, I realized it was thicker, folded, and sealed. My pulse quickened when I noticed the wax, black, cracked with age, stamped with a court insignia that had long since fallen out of use. Around its edges, faint letters spelled out the words * by order of the court, 1891. * For a long moment, I simply stared at it, unsure whether to feel curiosity or dread. The envelope felt oddly warm in my hands despite the chill of the room. Its surface had been partially eaten by time, the corners brittle, but the seal was still intact, untouched by moisture or decay. Someone had hidden it deliberately. I sat back against the desk and examined the area more closely. The floorboards around the gap were uneven, and when I pressed lightly on one, it shifted slightly under my weight, revealing a hollow beneath. I removed the panel carefully, revealing a small cavity that smelled faintly of earth and rust. Inside was a cluster of objects, a rusted key, a strip of torn ribbon, and another folded paper that had fused to the wood with age. I didn't dare disturb it. The placement of these items felt ritualistic, intentional, like a message left for someone specific. As I stared at the sealed envelope, I couldn't shake the sensation that I had interrupted something. The silence in the room had deepened, pressing down against my ears, and even the rhythm of the rain outside seemed to fade. I placed the envelope on the desk, next to the open ledger, and leaned closer to read what little was visible through the thin parchment. The faint outline of handwriting bled through the interior, though I couldn't decipher it. I turned it over in my hands and noticed a faint scrawl along the back, written in ink that had bled over time, *, property to remain sealed pending verification of occupancy. *, the same phrase from the audit request. My throat went dry. The connection between the letter and the audit instructions couldn't be coincidence. Someone, perhaps the very client who commissioned the job, had known about this envelope all along. But why would a court order from 1891 still be sealed, and why was I the one sent to find it? I felt the urge to open it, to tear through the wax and see what it contained, but something about the air in the room warned against it. The lantern flickered violently as a sudden gust slipped through the cracks in the wall. I turned, half expecting to see the door open, but it was closed tightly. When I looked back at the desk, I froze. The ledger I had left open had changed. The page I had been reading, the one filled with names, now bore a faint new mark, a single line drawn beneath the last name, as though someone had just underlined it. My hands trembled as I touched the ink, it was still damp. I stepped back, breathing hard, my gaze darting between the letter, the desk, and the floorboards. The stillness of the house was deceptive. Every creak of wood seemed deliberate, every whisper of wind like the intake of a breath. I picked up the envelope again, intending to slip it into my briefcase, but as my fingers brushed the wax, I felt a strange vibration, a faint hum that seemed to emanate from inside the paper itself. I dropped it instinctively, and the sound stopped. The lantern flickered once more before steadying, but the shadows had shifted. The shape of my own silhouette stretched unnaturally across the wall, elongated and trembling, as if something stood just behind me, mimicking my movements a fraction too late. When I finally gathered the courage to leave the study, I found the corridor darker than before. The grandfather clock at the far end had stopped, its pendulum hanging motionless in mid-swing. I checked my watch, it too had frozen, the second hand stuck between ticks. The storm continued outside, but the sound of it no longer reached the house. It was as though the estate existed in a pocket of silence that obeyed no natural rule. The envelope remained on the desk, waiting, its seal gleaming faintly in the lantern light. I knew I should report the discovery immediately, log it as evidence and leave it unopened for official review. Yet something about it refused to let me go. The ledgers, the vanished records, the phrase verification of occupancy, they all pointed toward a mystery far older than any financial dispute. I looked back once more before closing the door, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw movement behind the glass of the study's window. A pale outline, watching from the darkness beyond the rain. I blinked, and it was gone. But the air in the hallway had changed, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable sound of paper shifting on the desk, as though unseen hands were unfolding the envelope I had left behind. The first night in the Mirrow Estate was one of uneasy silence, a silence that felt manufactured, as though the house itself had decided to hold its breath. I had set up camp in the small guest room adjacent to the study, partly because it was the only space with a functioning lock and partly because I wanted to stay close to the ledgers and the sealed court order. The storm had calmed into a dull patter, the kind that lulls ordinary houses into rest, but Mirrow wasn't an ordinary house. Even in stillness, it seemed to murmur beneath its walls, an irregular pulse that I could almost feel through the floorboards when I lay down. I tried to tell myself it was old plumbing, the wind in the ducts, the weight of rain on the roof. But the sound didn't behave like anything natural. It had rhythm. It paused. It listened. Around midnight, I awoke to a faint scratching, so delicate it could have been mistaken for the brushing of branches outside the window. But when I opened my eyes, the window was shut, and the curtains barely moved. The sound came again, closer this time, from beneath the floor. I sat up slowly, holding my breath, trying to isolate the noise. It was intermittent, irregular, like a pen dragged gently across parchment. Then it stopped, and for a moment I convinced myself it had been my imagination. That comfort lasted only a few seconds before a different sound took its place, the distinct creak of footsteps in the corridor beyond the door. At first, I assumed the caretaker had finally arrived late in the night, but when I called out, the footsteps stopped immediately. I waited, listening. A long pause followed, so long that I began to count the seconds under my breath. Then, from the far end of the hallway, came the faint metallic chime of the grandfather clock. Only this time, it didn't strike the correct hour. It rang 13 times. Each note echoed through the house, heavy and deliberate, until the air itself seemed to vibrate. I swung my legs over the bed and grabbed my flashlight. The beam trembled slightly as I approached the door, but I told myself the logical thing: old houses creak, gears slip, clocks miss fire. I opened the door. The hallway stretched before me, long and unbroken, yet somehow changed. The light from my room barely reached the nearest portrait, and beyond that, the rest of the corridor lay swallowed in darkness. The clock at the end of the hall glinted faintly, its pendulum still motionless, frozen mid-swing just as it had been before. But the echo of those 13 chimes still hung in the air, as if they refused to fade completely. I swept the beam of my light along the walls. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a door, one I hadn't noticed earlier, slightly ajar near the far end of the corridor. I took a cautious step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. The sound seemed to ripple outward, traveling farther than it should have, as though the noise itself was being carried deeper into the house. As I neared the open door, I caught the faint scent of candle wax and something older, like soot or burnt paper. The room beyond was dark, except for a small glow at the center, a lantern resting on a table, its flame flickering weakly. It hadn't been there before. I approached slowly, my heart beat loud in my ears, and saw that the table was covered with loose papers. At first glance, they looked like the ledgers from the study, but when I leaned closer, I realized they weren't financial records. They were letters, old, torn, some written in the same spidery handwriting as the envelope I had found earlier. The ink had bled over the years, making most of the text unreadable, but a few lines stood out clearly. Asterisk, she will not leave until they are all accounted for. Asterisk, another read. Asterisk, keep the room sealed. They speak when the wind is quiet. Asterisk. I heard a faint shuffle behind me and turned instantly, the flashlight beam cutting across the dark. The hallway was empty, but something had changed in the air, a pressure, as if the temperature had dropped sharply. The lantern on the table flickered, guttered, then steadied again, and that's when I saw it. The mirror on the opposite wall, its surface so clouded with dust it barely reflected anything, now held faint impressions, like the suggestion of movement behind glass. The outlines of several figures stood faintly in the reflection, their forms pale and indistinct. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room behind me was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figures were gone, replaced only by my own dim reflection, pale and shaking. I stepped closer, lifting the light to inspect it, and froze. In the thin layer of dust coating the mirror's surface, a series of finger marks appeared, 5 distinct lines slowly dragging downward from the inside, as though something behind the glass had tried to reach out. I stumbled backward, the flashlight clattering to the floor, the beam skittering wildly across the walls. When I scrambled to pick it up, the lantern on the table extinguished itself. The room plunged into darkness, except for the narrow beam of my flashlight, and I caught a final glimpse of the mirror as I turned toward the door. My reflection was gone. In its place stood a woman's silhouette, her head slightly tilted, her hand resting against the glass exactly where the smears had been. I bolted into the hall and slammed the door behind me, pressing my weight against it as if that could keep the past from escaping. My breathing came ragged, uneven, and as I tried to steady myself, I heard it again, the footsteps. Only this time, they weren't confined to the corridor. They were above me, in the ceiling, faint but unmistakable. I stood frozen, counting each step as it moved from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped directly overhead. The sound of whispering followed, not words exactly, but fragments of phrases too soft to make sense of. It wasn't just one voice either, it was many, layered and hushed, overlapping in a slow rhythm that seemed to form its own language. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the guest room with the lantern lit until dawn finally broke, though the light outside did little to soften the unease that had taken root. When I returned to the corridor in the morning, the door I had slammed shut was now wide open again. The mirror stood untouched, its surface dull and lifeless, as though nothing had ever happened. The papers from the table were gone, but one new page lay in their place, torn from one of the ledgers I had been reading earlier. On it, written in that same delicate, shaking script, was a single line, asterisk, audit continues. All residents accounted for except one. Asterisk. Morning brought little comfort, only the illusion of safety that daylight often lends to places which should remain in shadow. The Mirrow Estate, bathed in pale grey light, looked less like a house and more like a ruin pretending to still be alive. I found myself sitting at the desk in the study again, staring at the sealed envelope I had left untouched the night before. The events of the previous hours seemed almost impossible to rationalize in the daylight, yet their traces lingered, the mirror with its faint streaks, the missing pages, the scent of extinguished wax that still clung faintly to my clothes. I should have logged everything for evidence, taken photographs, and left the premises until an official investigation could begin. But something about that letter wouldn't let me go. It sat there with the calm patience of something that had already decided my next move for me. I told myself I'd only examine it, not open it. I wanted to document its condition, record its existence, and confirm its connection to the estate's missing financial records. But as soon as I touched it, that faint hum returned, a vibration that wasn't sound so much as sensation, traveling up my arm like a pulse. The seal looked impossibly intact for its age, the wax glossy and unbroken, and the insignia pressed into it bore a set of scales unlike any legal emblem I recognized. When I tilted it toward the light, I noticed faint etching beneath the main stamp, almost invisible unless the light hit just right, * witness retained. * my mouth went dry. I flipped through the nearest ledger again, hoping for some explanation, and found a short entry near the back that hadn't been there before. The handwriting was older, shakier than the others. * by order of the court, testimony to remain confined within the property. *. The phrase repeated several times across different ledgers, each dated the same year, 1891. Whatever happened in that year had effectively frozen this place in a kind of legal and spiritual limbo. It wasn't just an audit I was performing anymore, it was an exhumation of something that should have stayed buried. I finally broke the seal. It didn't crack like old wax should, it peeled away silently, the surface splitting open without resistance. Inside was a single folded page, the edges browned with age but the ink surprisingly vivid. The script was formal, legalistic, but the language was wrong for a court order. It was too personal, too poetic in places, as though written by someone who believed the law could also command the supernatural. The document began like any formal decree, * by authority of the Crown and the Court of Record, in the matter of Mirrow Estate, the following shall be enacted. * but as I read further, the words grew more unsettling. * let it be known that the property known as Mirrow shall henceforth serve as the principal witness to the crimes here committed. Its walls having heard, its floors having borne witness, its silence having kept the truth, the estate shall remain sealed until every voice therein has been reconciled. * my heart thudded painfully in my chest as I reached the next section. * no living testimony shall leave its boundaries until the matter is closed in full. Any who enter with intent to audit, record, or reconcile shall be subject to inclusion as witness until the oath of the house is broken. *. I stared at the page, unable to breathe. It read less like law and more like a curse disguised in legal phrasing. The oath of the house, what did that mean? My rational mind searched for explanation. Perhaps it was metaphorical, a reflection of some long-forgotten scandal, a superstition woven into the estate's history. But the moment I tried to dismiss it, something shifted in the air around me. The faint vibration from before returned, stronger this time, and the light from the window dimmed as though a cloud had passed over, though when I looked outside, the sky was perfectly clear. The paper in my hand trembled faintly, and a small smear of fresh ink appeared where there had been none before, as though the document were still being written. I set it down on the desk and stepped back, but the ink continued to spread, the words forming as if from an invisible hand, * testimony in progress. * the letters glistened, dark and wet. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath fogging faintly in front of me, though the lantern flame didn't flicker. Every instinct told me to run, to leave the house behind, yet I couldn't bring myself to cross the threshold. It felt as though the air itself had thickened into something solid. From somewhere deeper in the house came a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a wooden table. I grabbed the court order and stumbled into the hallway, calling out for the caretaker again, for anyone, but my voice fell flat. It didn't echo, it didn't carry. It simply stopped. The tapping continued, growing more insistent, leading me toward the great hall at the center of the manor. The double doors were closed, though I didn't remember closing them. I reached for the handle and hesitated, my pulse hammering in my throat. The sound was coming from within. I pushed the doors open. The hall was vast and dim, the chandelier above draped in cobwebs. The floorboards gleamed faintly, though no light source should have reached them. And there, at the center of the room, lay a table covered in papers, ledgers, letters, and loose sheets that fluttered though no wind stirred them. The tapping came from a chair at the far end, where the shape of a man sat slumped forward, his head bowed. My mind refused to accept what my eyes saw at first. The figure was perfectly still, grey with dust, his skin shrunken tight against his skull. In his hand was a quill, its tip resting on a ledger that bore my own name written in fresh ink. The tapping continued even as I realized his hand wasn't moving, it was the quill itself, gently striking the page, as though invisible fingers guided it. My stomach turned to ice. I backed away slowly, clutching the court order like a shield, and the quill stopped. For a heartbeat, the silence returned, thick and suffocating. Then, in a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls, I heard the same phrase repeated over and over, soft, rhythmic, judicial in tone, *, witness retained. Witness retained. Witness retained. *. The paper in my hand began to tremble violently. The ink on the document bled across the page, erasing the original text until only one line remained legible. *, the house testifies still. *. I looked up at the figure in the chair, half expecting it to collapse or crumble, but it remained frozen, pen poised. Only now, behind him, the shadows along the wall were shifting. They stretched upward and outward, taking on faint human shapes, several of them, perhaps a dozen, all facing me. Their movements were subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably deliberate. As I stumbled back toward the door, the quill lifted itself once more and scratched a new word beneath my name, present. I didn't remember running back to the study, but when I came to, I was standing in front of the desk again, the court order spread open where I had dropped it. My hands were trembling so violently that the edges of the page quivered in rhythm with my pulse. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get into my car, to drive until the estate was a blur behind me, but something had changed. The air had grown dense, weighted, as if every molecule of it conspired to keep me there. My briefcase lay open on the floor, its contents scattered, and among the papers was one of the ledgers, the one that had listed the house's staff. I hadn't touched it since the first night, yet it now lay open to a blank page. Slowly, as I stared, ink began to bleed through the surface, forming a title at the top of the sheet, *residence. Below it, one by one, the names began to appear again. They weren't written in neat lines but rather in erratic, trembling script that seemed to crawl out of the page. Clara Hensley's name appeared first, followed by a string of others I recognized from earlier entries. Then the writing stopped. The pen resting beside the ledger twitched slightly, its tip hovering just above the page. I watched in paralyzed silence as it dipped, then began to move again, forming letters I could not mistake, *Thomas Weller * my name. My throat tightened. The ink glistened wet and black. The quill made a faint scratching sound that echoed in the quiet room like breathing. I stumbled backward, overturning the chair behind me. The ledger snapped shut on its own, the force of it so sharp that dust lifted from its edges. For several seconds, nothing moved. The house seemed to be holding its breath again, the same dreadful pause that had preceded every strange event since my arrival. I reached for my coat and made for the door, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The mechanism turned freely, yet the door stayed firm, as if something on the other side pressed against it. I tried the windows next, they were stuck too, the panes fogged over not from condensation but from something on the inside. Words were beginning to appear there as well, faintly traced in the misted glass, *account open. I backed away slowly, trying to steady my breathing. The logical part of me insisted there was an explanation: gas, exhaustion, hallucination, but none of those things could make ink write itself or glass breathe words. My eyes fell to the court order again. The once clear writing had completely rearranged itself, the neat columns of text dissolving into sprawling lines. The new message was brief, written in the same dark ink as before: all witnesses must be recorded. Auditing complete. The lamp on the desk dimmed, and in the shifting half-light, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the far wall, just beneath the mirror, there hung a framed document I could have sworn wasn't there the night before. It was yellowed with age, the glass cracked, but through it I could make out a familiar signature: mine. I approached cautiously, heart pounding. The paper was a replica of the audit assignment, dated the same day I had accepted the case, but at the bottom, in handwriting not my own, a single sentence had been added: verification of occupancy complete. Beneath that, my name appeared again, written with the same trembling ink as in the ledger. I touched the frame, and it was warm. My reflection in the cracked glass shifted slightly, though I hadn't moved. It tilted its head to one side, slowly, like a curious animal studying something fragile. Then it smiled, a faint, knowing smile that didn't belong to me. The sound of paper shifting filled the room once more, this time from every direction. The ledgers rustled, drawers creaked open, and the steady rhythm of a quill scratching began again. I turned in circles, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The sound came from everywhere: the walls, the floorboards, even the ceiling, as if the whole house was writing at once. I grabbed my phone, though I already knew there would be no signal, and tried to capture a photograph of the ledger. The screen flickered to black. When it came back to life, the camera had taken a picture on its own, a blurred image showing not the study but a long hallway filled with standing figures. My stomach twisted. I glanced at the corridor outside, half expecting to see them, but it was empty. The house had begun to hum faintly again, the same vibration that had come from the envelope, only stronger now, more deliberate. The grandfather clock began to chime, though it was nowhere near the hour. Each toll reverberated through the floor, shaking the loose papers from the desk. I shouted into the silence, demanding that whatever was here show itself, that it stop playing tricks, that it let me leave. The moment the words left my mouth, the air shifted. Every candle and lamp in the room extinguished at once. In the darkness, I heard the slow creak of the study door opening. A faint glow spilled from the hallway, a sickly, pale light that moved like water, bending and flickering without a source. I couldn't bring myself to step closer, but I didn't have to. Something was coming through. At first it looked like mist, a soft grey that clung to the edges of the doorframe, but within it were shapes, faces forming and dissolving, mouths moving soundlessly. The whispers came next, faint and overlapping, the same chorus I'd heard before but now louder, more urgent. They spoke in fragments, words I couldn't fully make out, though one repeated often enough to pierce through the rest: stay. I stumbled backward, knocking into the desk. The ledger flew open again, and the pages turned rapidly, stopping on one final entry. The ink wrote itself across the paper even as I watched: audit closed. Resident confirmed. The air around me grew heavy, pressing against my chest until I could barely draw breath. I reached for the door again, desperate to escape, but my hand met not wood but something solid and smooth, like glass. The surface was cold beneath my palm, and when I looked closely, I saw my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me anymore. The figure in the glass wore the same clothes, bore the same face, yet its eyes were wrong, flat, dark, endless. Behind it, the study was empty, stripped bare of furniture and light. I hit the glass with my fist, and the reflection struck back, perfectly synchronized, not with malice but with inevitability. The hum of the house rose to a low roar. Every ledger in the room snapped shut at once, the sound like a dozen doors closing together. Then, silence. I stood alone, trembling, staring into the glass that now showed nothing at all. On the desk, the court order lay open once more, the ink glistening faintly in the half-light. A final line had appeared beneath the others, written as neatly as a signature on a completed file, *Estate records updated. All witnesses retained. Audit complete. *.